Boxers who were caught were summarily executed, some in a cruel fashion. In June, Giles recorded how Chinese seen near the compounds were shot at. One night, the Austrians opened fire with a machine gun on a group of Chinese seen carrying lamps. On 14 June, German Marines shot more than a dozen Chinese for being, in their words, too noisy. In response, a mob armed only with poles charged the Germans. 4 Chinese were killed and many wounded. No Europeans were hurt.
Who was the man who compiled these records? Who was Lancelot Giles? Was he a trustworthy reporter?
He was working in China for most of his life as a diplomat, and he showed all the characteristics necessary for a public servant working overseas. He was impartial, he was objective, he showed lots of forbearance and patience in what he was doing. He didn't have a particular drum to beat, he just reported what he saw. And he certainly did that during that very important time of the Boxer uprising in the early part of the 20th century.
The propaganda excesses were not all on the side of the Western media. Boxer propaganda was circulated too. There were Chinese sources that opposed the Boxers and published their own propaganda. The Boxers also encouraged their followers by means of propaganda. Here they illustrate a fanciful view of events, with the hated foreign troops being dispatched by sword-wielding imperial soldiers. The reality in Beijing was not as clear-cut as reported by the correspondence of Boxer supporters. There was no siege as portrayed in the Hollywood movie 55 Days at Peking. There were no Chinese batteries of big guns, no attacks on the walls, no heavily armed attackers in uniform. The Boxers were indeed demonstrating with some violence, but their attacks were not coordinated, well planned, nor pressed home, and they never looked like capturing the legation quarter. Also, when the foreign armies arrived in August, the reaction of those in the compound was not ecstatic, as in the film, and in fact was almost nonchalant. Here is a photo of the first Sikhs to arrive. Here is the British Minister Sir Claude MacDonald watching them. By late 1900, there were no less than 45,000 foreign troops in North China. The newly arrived soldiers, as well as the people from the legations, looted the capital thoroughly. In the words of a leading historian, Sterling Seagrave, they emptied Peking of everything of value, often beaten to the choicest loot by the diplomats. Even temples were burnt. This was followed by a triumphal parade through the imperial palace. Over the next 2 years, the Allied armies carried out punitive expeditions throughout the countryside, and many locals died. It was not until 1901 that the powers and the imperial authorities came to an agreement that allowed the Empress to return to the capital at the cost of paying a large indemnity. Here, the imperial cavalcade is about to offer thanks for their return. In Europe, there was exultation following the foreign occupation of Beijing and its surrounding areas. There was one real siege in Beijing at the time, when those trapped were under serious risk of being overrun and slaughtered. That siege took place around the Catholic Cathedral in Beijing at the so-called Northern Compound, or Baitang. The leader of the besiege was a Catholic prelate, Monsignor Favier. Nearly 4,000 people, mainly Chinese Christians, took refuge in the compound, which was defended by just 41 French and Italian Marines. The survivors are pictured here. By the time that siege lifted, 400 people, including women and children, had died, many more than died during the more publicised events around the legations. One difference was that there were no foreign correspondents in the cathedral. In the legations, there were several correspondents, including the ambitious Australian George Morrison, who publicised himself as Chinese Morrison, or Morrison of Peking, even though he had never learned to speak Mandarin. His exaggerated accounts, including details of his own heroism, filled the columns of the Times in London. After the arrival of foreign armies, he was among the more enthusiastic looters of Chinese treasure. What remains today are the legations in Beijing, the scene of conflict and controversy. The mighty walls of the Tartar city have largely been demolished. The walls of the imperial palace, the Forbidden City, remain, and these are reminders of the days when the emperor ruled the Celestial Empire. Enough sections of the walls remain to remind observers how magnificent the walled city once was. Where many of the walls once stood, there are now wide traffic arteries. Sometimes the city is a victim of its own traffic where once foreign armies paraded. The legation quarter stood to the east of Tiananmen Square, and tourists today can reach it with a short walk. The number of legations and defended buildings was not large. There were barely a dozen large buildings. The British legation, the Russian legation, the United States mission, the German legation, the Japanese legation, the French legation, the Italian legation, the Austrian legation, the Spanish legation, the Dutch legation, then various buildings such as the hotel, post office and club. Also some Chinese properties. In all, it was not more than a couple of city blocks. The barricaded area started as a rough square, but after a panic and retreat in the initial days of riots, it was re-established as an irregular perimeter that can today be walked around in a leisurely half hour. Few of the original buildings still stand, and the city authorities have an understandable lack of motivation to highlight remaining features. It takes an assiduous search through back alleys past small restaurants to find the site of the British legation. What was Canal Street and a boundary of the quarter is now an upmarket shopping plaza. Where boxers once rioted, there are stores advertising the latest in international fashions. Where once there was the sound of gunfire, now there is broadcast music. The Journal of Lancelot Giles is today kept in the archives of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. His photographs are preserved in the library of the Australian National University. Giles took hundreds of photographs of China, both in Beijing and during his later career. Many of the books written about the events in Beijing, both the accurate and the inaccurate, have used some of his photos, not always with attribution. Giles's records in film and print form one of the most valuable archives of the reality of events in Beijing in 1900. These are more of his photographs. A messenger who went to Tianjin and back, aged 14. Loopholes across the canal. Nordenfelt gun in action. Prisoners to be shot.
With hindsight, questions arise about the true nature of events in Beijing from June to August of 1900. Was it a real siege? It's very hard to answer yes to that. These are Chinese barricades on the walls, maybe to protect the locals from the trigger-happy foreigners. Was there a real threat of a massacre? Few of the boxers had guns, and it's hard to take prepared positions from well-armed troops when the attackers only have sticks and knives. Were the foreigners really besieged? Individuals left the legations and visited homes or friends throughout the city. The commissariat met outside food suppliers and made purchases from time to time. Here's a meeting between the foreigners and Chinese officials. Note the Marine with hands in pockets. He's not really tense and nervous, is he? The conclusion based on Giles's evidence has to be that the events in the legations in June to August 1900 were a series of riots that occurred all over the city, as shown by one of Giles's photographs of 16 June. Giles' photos and his journal present a picture vastly different from the one that the media of the time presented and which has lasted for far too long.